organizational structure, but the Communist Party wouldn't necessarily know that. What they saw was a lot of people doing the same things at the same time, and this was largely coordinated through internet, cell phones. I mean, we see a lot of these spontaneous phenomena now where a lot of people do the same things at the same time through kind of social networks or internet networks or cell phone networks. But at the time of the growth of Falun Gong, the Communist Party wasn't used to this, and they just thought that there was an organization behind it when they saw a lot of people doing the same thing at the same time. And Jiang Zemin got very very suspicious and upset, and basically led the party to ban Falun Gong. Because there was a lot of people throughout the party at the time who were Falun Gong up and down the system. When Falun Gong was initially banned in 1999, there was a lot of leakages about what was going on, and so we have, we've included it in our book, the actual memorandum that Jiang Zemin wrote to the Central Committee of the Communist Party about why Falun Gong should be banned. And I'll read you a sentence or two from it, which gives you a flavor of what was concerned to them. This is just the end of the memorandum. And these are the words of Jiang Zemin. He says, "Can't the Marxism our communists have, the materialism, atheism we believe in, really win over that suit of stuff aired by Falun Gong? If that were not the case, would it not be a thumping joke? Our leading cadres at all levels, especially high-level officials, should become sober now." So you can get the sense of kind of jealousy and fear, and the fear of being held up to ridicule, the discomfort about the popularity of this group, its ideological variance with communism. These were the driving forces behind the banning. Now, the banning was June, it was decided by the Communist Party in June 1999, and the party set up an office to repress the movement. It was called the 6/10 office because that was the date of the decision, June 10th, 1999. And the announcement of the banning by the state organs was July 1999. And it led to actually a lot of demonstrations from Falun Gong practitioners that opposed the banning and thought, the Communist Party they didn't understand why it was being done, because Falun Gong was harmless, Falun Gong was helping people, and so you got these protests. And the communists got into a catch-and-release system. They'd pick these people up doing the protest, tell them to stop the practice, and then let them go. But this kind of banning with a catch-and-release wasn't really working. So the party held a mass gathering of its officials in November 1999 to try to deal with the fact that the banning hadn't worked. So they developed a new policy, and again, there was it was a meeting for which there was a leakage, and again, in our book, we have this statement by the head of the 610 office to 3,000 party officials gathered on November 30th, 2010 in Li Langxing, and he says to the people there, and I quote, "Defame their reputations, bankrupt them financially, and destroy them physically." And so at this point, the repression becomes a lot more brutal. And instead of the catch and release, what happens is, people will still, once they're arrested, if they renounce Falun Gong in writing, be released, but if they don't, they're tortured. And they quickly became the number one torture victims in China. According to the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, Manfred Nowak, they were 2/3 the torture victims in China by the time he was doing his reports. People would be tortured, and if they recanted after torture, they would then be released. But if they didn't recant after torture, they would just disappear into the Chinese detention system. China runs a sequence of re-education through labor camps, quite a lot of them, and they don't publicize where the camps are or how many camps there are or how many people are in the camps, but outside NGOs estimate that there are about 2 million people in these camps, and about 1 million are Falun Gong. And so the people who don't recant just disappear into these re-education through labor camp systems. And then we have this statement of Annie in our conclusions. Now, that's one strand, the persecution of Falun Gong. A second strand is the development of organ transplants in China. The organ transplant system began in China in the early 80s, 84, 85, and in the sourcing from the very start was prisoners sentenced to death and then executed. There was a Chinese law of 1984 that allowed the sourcing of organs from prisoners without the consent of either them or their families. Obviously, the consent helped, but the consent was not necessary. The way the law read, it said that if the family could not be located, or if the family didn't claim the body, then the organs of the prisoners could be used for transplants. And in the early 80s, the transplant technology in China was relatively primitive, but it developed over time. And this was, of course, also at the same time, as I mentioned, where the money was being withdrawn from the health system because the shift from socialism to capitalism. And the hospitals started realizing that selling organs was a big moneymaker, and eventually it became their prime moneymaker. So when we did our report, we could see in our websites the hospitals advertising, this is, they actually said this is our prime source of money. And they started selling transplants around the world, because everywhere in the world there's a demand for organs and a waiting time for organs, and people very anxious to get organs. And what China could promise is quick turnarounds, because they started fiddling with the dates of executions to make them coincide with when organs needed to be transplanted. Now, there's a lot of people being sentenced to death and then executed in China. There's, I think, some 68 death penalty offenses. But it didn't take long for the demand for organs worldwide, because we're talking about a worldwide market now, not just the Chinese market, to strip the supply from the Chinese death penalty. So by the time we get to 2001, they've exhausted the death penalty supply, and they have in their prison system this group of people who are vilified, depersonalized, and also unidentified. David Kilgore and I, we've interviewed a number of Falun Gong practitioners and non-Falun Gong practitioners who got out of China, got out of prison, and got out of China, and they tell us a number of things. They tell us that the Falun Gong practitioners are systematically blood tested and organ examined, and the non-Falun Gong practitioners are not. They tell us that the only ones who get out of the prison system are people who recant. The non-recanters don't get out. They also tell us that the population of Falun Gong in prisons, there are two groups, the self-identified and the non-self-identified. The self-identified get shipped back to their hometown, and very often their immediate community is victimized as well as them. As a result of which, there's many who don't self-identify in order to protect their immediate community. And these non-self-identified, they don't tell anybody who they are. They don't tell the jailers. They don't tell the other inmates. The people who get out tell us the non-self-identified outnumber the self-identified. But the people we interview are all the self-identified. The non-self-identified, they just don't get out. So we got this huge population of non-self-identified. So their families don't know where they are. The jailers don't know who they are. So this is a very vulnerable population, and there's no, of course, legal system that asserts rights against the government. There's no access to these re-education through labor camps. There's this huge demand for organs, and a lot of money to be made. The available death penalty supply is exhausted, and this group is depersonalized, dehumanized, marginalized. Although the Falun Gong are banned because of their popularity, that's not what eventually becomes the party line for the Communist Party. They don't. I mean, the Communist Party about the propaganda, the Communist Party line about the Falun Gong is not, we have decided to ban them because they're too popular. The Communist Party line is, we have decided to ban them because they're an evil cult. They kill themselves, they kill their children, they're under the control of their puppet master, Li Hongji, and so on. This kind of vilification leads the jailers to think of them as not really people. And this indeed is, again, something the people we get out who we interview tell us, that the jailers say, you know, you're not really human beings, we can do whatever we want with you, and so on. So we get this phenomenon of demand for organs, the depersonalization of Falun Gong, and then Annie makes her statement, and we come to this conclusion. Now, we have many different pieces of evidence that lead to the conclusion we do, and I'm not going to have time to go through a lot of it, but let me go through a few things with you. One of them is calls. One piece of evidence we have is callers making calls around China to various hospitals, pretending to be relatives of patients who need transplants, asking the hospitals if they have organs of Falun Gong practitioners for sale. The logic being that the Falun Gong is an exercise regime, the Falun Gong practitioners, because the exercise are healthy, their organs are healthy, and they're going to be better organs than other organs. So that's the logic. And the callers made a lot of calls, and they got rejections. They got hang-ups. They got people quarreling with them. But about 15% of the calls, they got admissions. Yeah, yes, we have organs of Falun Gong practitioners for sale. And this map here shows the places in China where callers got admissions, that there were organs of Falun Gong practitioners for sale. And they're throughout China, as you can see, these admissions. Now, once our report came out, on the whole, the Chinese government was unresponsive. They tended to say, the typical response is, we're anti-China, or Falun Gong is an evil cult. I mean, it just kind of ignores the issue. But occasionally they would address some of our evidence, and they did address this. There was a TV documentary that was put out by Phoenix TV in Hong Kong, Mandarin Station. I think it was one time owned by Murdoch, but it was basically a Chinese government documentary, and you can actually get it at embassies and consulates. They didn't interview us, but they interviewed one of the people. Well, they interviewed a couple of the people we called. One of the people we called, he said, no, absolutely not, and they interviewed him, and that's what he said in the interview, in the documentary, and that was right. Another person we called was Lu Guoping, who actually admitted that, basically what he said is, well, we used to sell the organs of Falun Gong practitioners, and I'd go to the prison myself and pick them out, the Falun Gong prisoners, but we don't have access to the prisons anymore, and there's another doctor in another hospital that does, and I suggest you go to him. That was basically the nature of the conversation. And I should say that in China, there's military and civilian hospitals, and it's unlike in other countries. The military is kind of a conglomerate business, and it's in all sorts of business activities, including the selling of organs. And so there's big military transplant hospitals, and the military hospitals have a lot better access to organs than the civilian hospitals, because the organs come from prisons, and the military are basically, it's the same culture as the prisons and prison guards, and they're also a lot less subject to control from the health. Well, they are not subject to control from the health ministry, so it's a lot easier for them to get organs. So that was typically what would be happening. And we talked to patients who would be going into China, and they would say either for transplants, either they'd be going to military hospitals or they'd be going to civilian hospitals where the doctors were military people with military titles and military uniforms and so on. So anyhow, Lu Guoping says to us, yes, we used to, but now not anymore, and go to this guy. So the Chinese government documentary says, they interview Lu Guoping, and they say, do you get this call? And they give him the transcript of the call. And for each of these calls, we have a transcript, we